demos today by doing a large lidded jar. Throw large in quotes, right? Large to some people is like, oh, it's just normal size. But I do want to show you guys how I center. This is 4 pounds of clay, right? So like roughly double, I think, what most of you like traditionally work with. Which isn't a huge piece of clay, right? But it's sort of interesting how much more difficult going from 1 pound to 2 is, and then going from 2 pounds to 3, and then from 3 to 4. And then on a standing wheel, I don't ever throw more than 5 pounds because I really have to like manipulate my body to get enough force to center properly, right? So after 4 or 5 pounds, I usually switch to a sit-down wheel because if I need to, I can sort of stand up and lean my whole body weight on it, right? This is 4, so we'll see how we do, right? Same thing as usual, right? Get it in the middle. I kind of do like a smack center where I spin it around and just kind of smack it into a mountain shape. The closer you have it to the very center before you start centering, like theoretically, the easier it should be. We'll see though, right? So after you get, I would say above 2 pounds, right? Like 1 pound, 1.5 pounds, I don't ever really find the need to do the wheel wedging, like coning up, smashing down thing. It's such a little amount of clay that you can kind of get away with just the chair karate chop. Once you start getting to 3 pounds, 4 pounds, it becomes super useful to do that, right? So, I'm gonna have my wheel going max speed. I'm gonna wedge in with my sort of chair hand into my body. My other hand, instead of being a karate chop, is gonna come across from that, and they're gonna meet like this, and I'm pushing in with the pads of my thumbs here, right? Like so. And as the clay rises, I sort of follow it up top. I usually do 1 or 2 of those pulling motions, or coning motions rather. Up to the top, right? Once I get to the top, I take my chair hand and then I kind of give it like an armrest. I don't know if you guys can sort of see that. Armrest over the top, and then I push down and forward like so. And it's okay if the bottom gets wobbly, we're just centering the top, and then we're trying to make the top center align with everything, right? So this usually takes a few tries. Do one more, and it should get closer and closer to center with each version of the cone up, cone down, right? So I get it to roughly here, then I kind of switch, right, because I'm pushing down in that way. To do sort of the finishing off of the centering, I sort of switch back to like a more intense version of the chair karate chop, where this hand has like a pinky all the way down to the bottom, and then I come in here, and sometimes if it's a big piece of clay, I'll pivot up like this, that way I can lean in like so. Does that make sense? And it's a rinse and repeat. It's okay if you lose your little nugget like that. Right there seems close enough to me, right? And there's just a lot of manipulation, right? It's very rarely you using strength to center everything, right? Like even when I do the chair karate chop on a small piece of clay, I tend to use my hips and my core a lot, right? So I tighten up my core, I can sort of tighten up my muscles. I don't use them for force, but I tighten them up so that they're immovable, right? And then I sort of either like wedge my hips into it, or I sort of figure out how I can generate force without using arm strength, because otherwise I would be super tired all the time. Hey! Alright, so we're doing a jar. I'm going to try to keep this pretty vertical for a while, right? The finger guns thing doesn't quite work with a piece of clay this big, right? So I'm going to do like a iteration of that where I just sort of do the whole thing with my fingertips like this. I find the center, fill the well with some moisture. Then we're going to go straight down. That seems pretty good. And then we're going to do the thing where we widen it out just a little bit, right? So I'm going to have my chair hand behind here, wrap my other hand with my thumb around like this. I'm going to push down with pressure basically coming from right under my knuckles, right? I'm going to push down and then pull out. I'm not pushing down with my fingertip necessarily, but mostly with this part, that kind of just keeps pressure from all sides of the like donut part of the ring that we're making here. And that helps it to not get super off center, right? Sometimes if you pull this out too far or too hard or too fast or too slow, there's a lot of ways it can go wrong, right? It has a tendency to throw the ring off, and we're trying to avoid that. Now that I'm here, I don't want my jar to have a super wide base. So I'm going to come in from behind, and now instead of pulling out, I'm going to use this hand to push pressure in, right with the pad of my thumb right here, just as if we were doing like chair karate chop and centering, right? We're doing that because I want to start with a volcano shape, because a volcano shape will yield me a cylinder, and if I try to make a cylinder, I'll end up with a ball, right? So we've got all this done. I do need to compress my bottom. Anybody have questions so far? Are we feeling good? So no matter how much clay I'm doing, for the most part, I sort of do all of these steps at max speed, right? And then after that, I'll sort of slow down, or we'll figure it out. You know what I mean? I find pulling at this speed is really dangerous because things have a tendency to become like really wobbly, really wide bowls. So the more clay I use, oftentimes the slower I pull as well, right? I just feel like I have more control that way. So we're going to do a couple of our muscle pulls. I'm doing that with like my sponge armor in my right hand. And I'm just trying to get some height and get some of that clay moved up. Most jars I make, if you want a jar to be like functional size, like you can get away with 2 pounds. You know what I mean? Like a coffee jar I can make with like 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds. This might be like kind of large to be useful, but like for some reason I really enjoy big jars. I don't use them for anything, but they look cool on a shelf, right? Yeah, well, that's the thing too. It's like same thing as pitchers, right? So a lot of times when people, like when potters make pitchers, they're making them as vases because people don't use pitchers in their like everyday life, right? But it's just one of those forms that we're like supposed to know how to make well, right? It's almost like a teapot. Like very few people use ceramic teapots still, right? But if you want to like be a potter, you have to have a teapot form. Make an iron, that's true. Iron, yeah. Put the iron in the fire.
Put the iron in the fire.
So now it's just a rinse and repeat, right? And I do the same, like most of the techniques are pretty much the same as if I was throwing a small piece of clay, but it's just a little slower and a little more safe, right? So make sure you lubricate the inside and the outside every time you do a pull. I do that by sort of making these scissors. And this does 2 things, right? It compresses the lip right here. And then if I pour water on my knuckles, it gets the inside wall and the outside wall, right? I see a lot of folks just like do this and then go for it, like, and you're not really, you didn't really saturate anything when you did that, right? So I use the sponge for at least 3 pulls because I'm trying to get as much of this clay from the bottom up now as possible, because the further into throwing we get, the harder it's going to be to do that. Get usually to here, right? And then I'll just go down and feel what's happening, right? So I still have a decent bit of thickness here, but it's not like 2 inches thick where I'm going to have to trim it all away. I think at this point I might do 1 more pull with my sponge, and then I might switch over to using my fingertips. It also gets tricky on a standing wheel because I'm only so tall, and if I want this thing to be this high, I'm going to be like pulling it like this, which isn't necessarily the best look or very conducive to good throwing. It also becomes very difficult in doing a big piece to keep your 2 hands touching, right? I don't know if you guys can see, but like to get the bottom, I have to touch way up here on my wrist, right? And honestly, I might even just start this one by not touching my hands together. And then once I get to a point where they can touch, I reach my thumb over, meet my other hand. Roughly at this point is where it would have helped for me to do this demo on a sit-down wheel, right? Reason being, I throw different if I'm going to throw something really tall, and I need to be taller to do it, right? So I'm going to do this with a stool here. If you were at a sit-down wheel, you would just be standing up for this part. It's much easier for you. So let's rehydrate things. And because it's hard to get my hands to touch on a thing once it gets to this height, right? Because it's like taller than my hand is. What I do is I sort of throw upside down with my thumb. That way my pinkies can sort of stabilize the piece. The thing that has a tendency to happen as you start to throw taller is you'll be pulling the bottom, but then the top will get off center and will sort of get away from you, right? And I found that this helps to alleviate that issue. So the way I do that, I come down here, thumb down at the very bottom, squeezes in, and then you rise up. I don't know if you guys can see what's happening with like my pinkies and stuff, is they kind of stabilize the piece as I'm going, right? And that keeps it like tall and cylindrical the whole time. Yeah, I'm gonna do it again. Careful, because if the flow comes out, it's not gonna finish this whole thing up. So, really close up. Let me wedge some of that clay in there at the bottom. I always start every pull out by making a ledge, right?
You're doing that with your thumb.
I'm doing that with my thumb.
And are you pulling against your middle finger and the inside?
Yes. So my inside hand doesn't change. My outside hand just switches from using the sponge or my middle finger as the source of pressure to my thumb. And if you guys like this hand, it's funny. The thumb seems like it's the important part. Really what's happening on this side of the pot with my hand sort of sprawled like this is what's important. That's what's keeping it from getting off center, right? And so we got like quite a bit more height from those couple pulls. I'll maybe do one more. But as you guys can see, like this is getting to like, oh, that jar is going to be too big to do anything with.
So your pressure points are where?
Thumb here, inside like you would normally do when you were throwing, right? So here and here, same thing as usual, right? Thumb goes a little bit below the middle fingers, and then you're squeezing in and then rising up.
And you do that just so you can stabilize it.
Yeah, the whole point of this, yeah, exactly, is so that my pinkies can stabilize the piece, otherwise the top gets away from me. Maybe one more. And the bigger a piece is, the less I worry about getting it like paper thin, right? Because it doesn't really need to be, and then also I don't want a thing that's this big. If it falls over, it's going to shatter into a million pieces. So I don't mind it being a little bit more substantial than I would usually do with something, right? So I also have a tendency to collar in quite a bit when I do this. And then from here, I might just switch over to shaping with the rib, right? You guys know the rib is my favorite tool. So I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna try to cut some of this skirt clay off. I'm not gonna be super greedy with it because I don't wanna cause a bunch of torque because that's gonna throw my top off. So I'm stabilizing the top with my other hand as I cut some of this skirt clay off. Like so. And then the tip for you is fill that moat that you just made with water, and that water will prevent your skirt that you're cutting off from jumping back up on your pot, right? So what I do is I use the wooden knife to do that. I then fill it with water, and then I come under with a needle tool on the underside. And this will really make it just sort of slop off, right? Which is what we're looking for. And that's also like, mostly when people throw cylinders, they throw kind of a cone shape, and then they cut the bottom off or they trim the bottom off to end up with a perfect cylinder, right? So from here, I'm just gonna strengthen the walls with some shaping and stretching. I could also make this like a little bit more rotund, but I don't really favor those shapes these days. And then I always come down and take a look at it from below to see if I actually like that shape or not, right? I think that's fine, but not great. So I'm gonna, while I'm down here, just shape the outside. Because I would prefer it to just be a very tall, very slightly conical shape. I'm not super worried about it becoming slightly off-centered because I can come in and collar it and it'll reset that center, right? So here, collar this in just a smidge. And again, I'm not super worried about this being very functional because right now it's not, you know what I mean, based on the shape. I just want it to look good. It's a lot of surface if you wanted to do surface decoration too, right? Scrape some of this slip off. And I think I am fine with that shape. Another thing I do on bigger pieces too, especially if I'm throwing a shape that's slightly more difficult to throw. So if this had a lot of sharp angles in it, right? That's very hard to do. Your clay gets tired really quickly. So what I have a tendency to do is throw a rough shape, and then I leave this attached to the wheel, and then I will trim it while it's attached, and then clean up that shape and make it much more sharp and clean. It's a jar, so we want to make sure our lip is nice and thick. And then I think we might call it there, right? Like just basically a big cylinder, but I'll be able to trim like subtle curves into it if I want to. I'll be able to trim subtle angles. I'll be able to trim different lines so that it looks more interesting. A lot of that happens at a later date. And that's the thing I constantly have to remind myself, is that it doesn't have to be necessarily perfect now. We just want to be most of the way there, because it'll probably be easier to make it look really refined at a later stage when the clay is a little bit more forgiving, right? That's totally fine. What I'm gonna do is measure the inside diameter of my pot over here. Let me do it here for the video. I'm just doing this, right? Measuring the inside diameter. And I always cheat it a little bit by making it slightly larger than it needs to be. I'd rather have a jar that barely doesn't fit as opposed to a jar that's really loose, right? Because I can always trim a lid back or trim the lip of my pot back a little bit to make it a really tight fit. And that's the thing that potters very much judge each other by, is like, if you get your lid to fit tight and you show one of us, we'll always be like, oh, so nice. Like, I don't know why, it's just a thing that that's how we describe if you like did a good job at making that lip, right? So from here, I can either use this, I can measure it, and then use another one. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to take this inside dimension and match it to what an outside dimension would be. And I'm going to do that by taking another set of calipers and sort of lining it up with that. And so the outside dimension of my jar should match this. Does that make sense to everybody? So like this is the shape you use for the inside, this is the shape you use for the outside. The fancy calipers are connected like this.
Hot tip, if you ever make a jar, and you know, sometimes you make two lids for a jar, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because like, are you gonna get the lid right on the first try? I don't
Probably
know,
not.
maybe, probably not. Someone told me that you can make the body of your jar, measure the inside of it, and then you put your calipers down on a piece of paper and you mark either side, and then you can write down what that is, so that later if you break the lid
Oh, smart.
or something like that, you can go back and have that wet measurement. Because once that pot dries out, you can't remeasure it. The measurement's going to be different.
Yeah.
So you can, you know, make a little line. You're like, this is for the pot that looks like this, and then you can always remake that lid.
That's a super helpful tip, because the amount of times, Julie's totally right. Lids are like handles in that you should make two for every pot, right? Because one of them's probably going to be either not so great or it will break on you. And the amount of times that I've made two lids and then I've been like, what does the bottom of my jar look like? And dumped my lid out and broken my backup lid is kind of like astronomical. It's like an absurd amount where like a thing was supposed to be a jar and then it ended up being a vase, right? That is one reason I make lids the way I do, is because if you make a lid with a gallery, which is basically like a lid that the form comes up and then there's like a little swoop at the inside, right, where a lid will sit, that is only useful as a lid. Right? The way I make lids, if I get rid of my lid, it still just looks like a vase and I'm fine with that, right? And that's partially because of that, right? Because I rarely do the like, I'm gonna measure this, I usually just get screwed, and then I go like, all right, guess you're a vase now, right? So, I'm gonna start out, this is probably, what, half a pound, a little bit less than half a pound. Yep, half a pound of clay. More than I need, right? But let's make a lid. So same concepts as before, except that everything's a little bit easier because it's not so much clay, right? So when I say I don't do the coning up, coning down thing on a small piece of clay, what I really mean is I replace the grandiose movement of squeezing up and doing this with just a left hand pressure makes the clay rise, right hand pressure makes the clay squeeze back down. So when I center a small piece of clay, there's a lot of this that happens. And that's the same motion, really, as the coning or wheel wedging, but it's just a little bit more subtle, right? So I'm going to make this nice and low and flat and wide. I don't need a gigantic lid, right? But I have a tendency to make lids much wider than I need them to be and then trim them to final diameter later, right? So I usually get something like this going on. I take my calipers, and I kind of line it up as close to the middle as I can, and I lean to one side. That way I can leave a mark somewhere that lets me know the rough dimension that my lid needs to be. Can you guys see that on video? That like little mark that I left? Yeah, good. So from there, what I usually do is pull a little bit of clay from the center here, because I don't want the center to be very thick, because thick things have a tendency to crack. And I'm only going to pull it out to that line, right? And then I'm going to compress the inside too, just as if this was like just a pot. I I usually will throw some kind of spirally doodad in there somewhere. That's a little severe, but something like that, right? We'll soften that back down. Just like a little touch. There's little things like that that I really like to see on pots as like you thought of every part of this process when you were making this, right? And that applies to feet, that applies to surface decoration. If I'm making a plate, I always try to have the top side of my plate, or rather the bottom side, reference what I'm doing surface-wise on the inside. On a lid, I make sure I do some kind of design or something so it doesn't just look super basic. Sort of same concept, right? And then I take the corner, as you guys know I use this for everything, I take the corner of my wooden rib, and right where that line was, I basically just push down a little bit. And that will yield me my flange. I'll then make this flange a little bit more substantial, right? And then the flange on the lid, you always want to sort of shape in like this, right? If it shapes in this way, it's gonna fit really wonky and it's not gonna look great. If it shapes in this way, it's almost like when you set it down inside the lid, it like guides itself in. Does that make sense to everybody? And this, for the most part, is how I make all my lids, right? I like this kind of lid the best. I'm gonna double check my measurements. I made it slightly wider than it needs to be, which I'm fine with because I can always trim it back. I'm gonna do a smidge of the trimming back now, just so I don't have to think about it. But I also know that I have a tendency to make this a little too small, so I very intentionally try to make it bigger than I think it needs to be because it'll end up being the right size, right? Round this out. This is obviously much, much wider than this, and I don't necessarily love that. I'm gonna get rid of just a smidge of this outside clay, just so my job is slightly easier later when I go to trim. Like so. And because I know I'm going to trim everything later, like this has a little bit of a lip to it, don't really care because I'm going to address that later, right? When the clay is much easier to work with. I usually do some kind of rough estimation. I'll like set it above like this, see how it fits, and then I know roughly how much I have to trim off later, right? I'll do that again for the camera, set it like this, know how much I got to trim off later. So like most things, right? So I'll leave this attached to the bat too. I'll put them both out in the sun or I'll dry them however I feel like drying them. Don't dry them too quickly because you'll get cracks in here, right? And then while this is attached, I'll just like trim up all the edges that need to be trimmed and then I'll slice under it and call it a day. Does that make sense? Cool. So that's making a large...
You what needs to be trimmed? You mean like the outside edges?
Outside edge needs to be trimmed. All this can be cleaned up a little bit. I want to trim it to where it just fits. Maybe with a little bit of wiggle. Doesn't have to have a lot, but it needs a little bit of wiggle. You also don't want this flange to be super deep because the deeper this flange is, the more glaze you have to wipe away on the inside of your pot, right? But one thing I like about this type of lid, most lids you're supposed to fire in the pot, right? Both of these things are substantial enough and like could be their own things if you wanted them to be, to where most of the time I can fire them totally separately and they still fit. So do like a little bit of wiggle just in case there's a slight bit of warping, it'll still fit, but I'm not so concerned that it's like airtight. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?